It began, as many stories do, in silence. Not the silence of danger, nor the weightless kind that settles over a sleeping cabin. This was something else. A quiet rooted in routine, deeply familiar, and utterly deceiving. On the morning of September 11th, 2018, Air India Flight AI-101 stood at the gate of Indira Gandhi International Airport. The Boeing 777 300ER had been fully fueled, loaded with 342 passengers and a flight crew of 15. A long-haul mission lay ahead, nearly 15 hours in the air, bound for New York's John F. Kennedy International. The aircraft, wide-bodied and seasoned, had served for nearly a decade. She had crossed oceans, endured turbulence, chased daylight and darkness alike. Today, she was ready once again. Or so it seemed. Inside the cockpit, 4 pilots made their final checks. Captain R. Palia, a man with over 2 decades in the skies, led the flight crew. Alongside him were 2 co-pilots and a relief captain, assigned to alternate during the journey. It was not common for 4 pilots to share a single rotation, but neither was this route, stretching over 11,000 kilometers, slicing through continents and time zones. Before pushback, a minor report had surfaced. The APU, Auxiliary Power Unit, had failed to activate. On paper, it was non-critical. The engines would supply primary power, and the aircraft could operate without APU support. But to a seasoned pilot, even a minor electrical fault leaves a trace, a question that hangs unanswered. Still, the decision was made. The flight would continue as planned. At 3 a.m. local time, an hour behind schedule, AI-101 lifted off from the darkened tarmac of Delhi, pushing skyward through layers of haze. The engines roared with confidence. The aircraft climbed smoothly. Everything, for a while, held steady. Roughly 40 minutes after departure, the aircraft reached its cruising altitude, 30,000 feet, just as it passed into Pakistani airspace. It was here that the silence shifted. Inside the cockpit, a soft chime. A single message blinked across the display. Radio altimeter 1, fault. Then another. Radio altimeter 2, fault. 2 of the aircraft's 3 radar altimeters had failed. The radar altimeter is not merely an instrument. It is the aircraft's sense of touch, measuring exact height above terrain, not by air pressure, but by bouncing a radio wave from the belly of the fuselage to the ground and back again. In fair weather, and at cruising altitude, it's a quiet companion. But in low visibility, or during landing, it becomes a lifeline. With only 1 remaining altimeter functioning, the redundancy was gone. And worse, no one could be certain the final reading was even accurate. Captain Palia remained calm. He reviewed the standby barometric altimeter, which still provided altitude based on air pressure. It would serve for now, but this was no longer a routine flight. Something, somewhere within the electrical system, had begun to unravel. He said nothing to the passengers. There was no need, not yet. In the cabin, families slept beneath blankets. College students leaned into their headrests, eyes closed, earbuds in. Outside, the sky darkened into the long, featureless stretch above the Arabian Sea. Inside, a quiet vigilance took hold. The aircraft moved forward, but behind the displays and below the floor panels, data was shifting. Systems that once communicated flawlessly were beginning to whisper, or worse, to lie. And this was only the beginning. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps us a lot. Thank you. Hours passed. Outside, the world slipped beneath them unnoticed. Vast deserts, the black waters of the Persian Gulf, the quiet folds of Eastern Europe. The passengers drifted between sleep and restless waking. In the cockpit, the glow of the displays remained steady, but beneath that surface, the cracks had begun to deepen. Captain Palia sat quietly, watching the numbers, listening for changes in tone or rhythm. In long-haul flights, a kind of hypnosis can settle over a crew. Time slows. Minds retreat into habit. But not today, not on this flight. There was something unsettled in the air, something he couldn't quite name, but he could feel it, like the pressure drop before a storm. Then, without warning, the traffic collision avoidance system failed. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't scream or flash. It simply went dark. One moment it was present, tracking nearby aircraft in invisible grids. The next, it wasn't. There was no system reboot, no diagnostic trail. The screen where blips had once floated now showed nothing but a silent field of gray. At 37,000 feet over the North Atlantic, TCAS is more reassurance than necessity. The airspace is vast, but over New York, just hours away, it is essential. TCAS is the unseen radar guard, the digital eye that sees what the human eye cannot. Without it, a pilot becomes alone in a crowded sky. Palia leaned forward. His hands moved to the circuit breakers, then paused. This wasn't an isolated glitch. It was the third failure. First the APU, then the radar altimeters, now this. It was no longer possible to dismiss them as coincidence. The aircraft was losing parts of itself, piece by piece. He didn't panic. He didn't even speak right away. Instead, he glanced at the others, eyes meeting in silent recognition. They knew the feeling. It was something every experienced pilot feels once, maybe twice in a lifetime, when the machine, once so reliable, begins to speak a different language. They continued the flight. The hours passed like slow waves. Engine performance remained steady. Cabin pressure held. Communications with ATC were clear. Yet, within the aircraft's central systems, something was deeply wrong. The failures weren't connected by a single wire or module. They crossed functions, cut through unrelated systems, safety, navigation, landing, surveillance. The one thing they shared was the backbone that carried all of them. The AIMS, Airplane Information Management System. Housed beneath the cockpit, this is the aircraft's central brain. It does not fly the plane, but it connects the systems that do. It shares data across sensors, verifies cross-checks, ensures that no reading is accepted without confirmation. If AIMS were failing, the crew wouldn't just be dealing with faulty systems. They'd be flying blind. And still, the aircraft moved forward. By the 10th hour in flight, they approached the eastern edge of the United States. The sun had risen somewhere behind them, casting soft light into the cockpit, but it did little to ease the tension. They called ahead. Air traffic control provided a weather update. The forecast for JFK was not good. Visibility limited. Cloud ceiling at 200 feet. Rain expected within the hour. No improvements on radar. Captain Palia considered the facts. They had no TCAS. 2 radar altimeters were still offline. Their ILS, Instrument Landing System, was beginning to respond erratically, cutting in and out as if unsure of its own presence. He turned toward his crew. "We may not be able to do an auto-land," he said quietly. No one argued. Fuel was beginning to run low. Not dangerously so yet, but there was no room for indecision. Diversions were possible, but limited. Boston was too far. Albany too uncertain. Newark was closer. The weather there marginally better. But there was one more decision to make. How do you land a plane when the very systems designed to guide you home are the ones disappearing beneath your hands? The sky ahead offered no answers, only silence, only cloud. And soon they would enter it. The coast of New Jersey rose beneath them, hidden by low, rolling layers of cloud. Somewhere beyond that mist, concrete runways stretched toward the river, bordered by fencing, radio towers, and emergency crews that had quietly been alerted. But from 37,000 feet, it was all abstraction, just a wall of white. Inside the cockpit of AI-101, there was no longer the illusion of time. Every decision now had weight. Every minute burned fuel that no longer felt abundant. The plane had been in the air for over 13 hours. The crew was tired, not physically drained, but worn thin by the kind of alertness that leaves no room for thought beyond the present moment. Captain Palia made the call. Newark. They would try it. There was no guarantee of a second chance. The descent began slowly, almost cautiously, as if the aircraft itself was unsure of what it might find below. With the ILS signal unreliable, they could not depend on autopilot to guide them to the runway. Instead, the crew would perform a non-precision approach, using LNAV and VNAV, a method relying on GPS coordinates and vertical paths rather than radio signals from the ground. It was precise enough in theory, but unforgiving in practice, especially in poor visibility. Unlike ILS, it offered no gentle voice leading them down, no safety net, just numbers, and the hope that the weather would open its hand before it was too late. At 5,000 feet, clouds swallowed them. The world outside the cockpit vanished into pale gray. Inside, the crew flew not with sight, but by calculation. The remaining radar altimeter ticked down, a lone voice among many that had gone silent. Palia gripped the controls, speaking softly to the co-pilot as he adjusted their course manually. Each movement was small, deliberate. A tap of rudder, a shift in pitch. At this altitude there was no room for instinct, only precision. They reached the decision altitude, 600 feet above the ground. It was the point at which they had to see the runway. If not, they would have to abort, circle, try again, if fuel allowed it. But this was the first attempt. It had to be the only one. No lights, no ground, nothing but silence, broken only by the call-outs from the first officer. 500 feet. 400. Still no runway. Clouds continued to press around them, thick and indifferent. The aircraft moved through them like a ghost. Then, at 300 feet, a glimmer, a break in the fog. A single edge of runway lighting flickered into view through the haze. Then another, and another. The strip of earth that had, moments before, been no more real than memory, now lay ahead, solid, narrow, and close. Palia didn't react. He adjusted slightly left, corrected the angle of descent, and disengaged autopilot fully. The aircraft was heavy now, dragging slightly with the flaps extended, landing gear already deployed. But it was in his hands, and he trusted them. They were slightly high, slightly off-center, but nothing that couldn't be corrected in those last, precious seconds. He pulled back gently, reducing power, letting gravity do the rest. The plane dropped into position like a stone finding its place in a riverbed. No bounce, no roll, just contact. The wheels touched down. Reverse thrust engaged. Brakes deployed. They were on the ground. A murmur passed through the cabin as the passengers felt the change. Some clapped quietly, more out of relief than celebration, but most remained unaware of how close they had come to not landing at all. Minutes later, as they taxied toward the gate, a storm rolled over the airfield. Rain hammered the windows. Visibility collapsed entirely. Had they arrived even 5 minutes later, the approach would have been impossible. The airport would have gone red. Diversion would have been mandatory. Fuel would not have lasted. But none of that happened. The passengers disembarked. The crew remained silent. The aircraft powered down, its systems dimming, as if exhaling after a long and uncertain journey. And still, no one knew what exactly had failed or why. That would come later. Or maybe not at all. For now, they had made it. But the questions were only just beginning. The terminal at Newark was calm by comparison. Passengers stood at baggage carousels, checked phones, called loved ones. A few complained quietly about the delay or the unexpected diversion. But most simply moved on. For them, it was another flight, another arrival, nothing more. But behind the closed doors of the cockpit, the feeling was different. The adrenaline that had carried the crew through those final moments was fading, leaving something colder in its place. The kind of fatigue that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from holding too much inside for too long. Captain Palia remained in his seat longer than usual, listening to the rain tap gently against the windshield. The systems were shutting down now, one by one. Engine heat faded. Displays dimmed. Yet for all the stillness, something inside the aircraft still felt wrong. Unresolved. In the hours that followed, technical crews began to inspect the aircraft. Initial diagnostics showed no catastrophic failure, no single point of collapse. The auxiliary power unit had failed, yes, but that alone could not explain what happened. The radio altimeters, the TCAS, the auto-landing interface, none had been tripped by conventional triggers. They had simply stopped responding. There were no melted wires, no failed fuses, no circuit boards scorched by power surges. Instead, the data logs revealed gaps, incomplete streams, missing packets of information that should have been relayed between systems, but weren't. A kind of silence inside the communication itself. The suspicion turned, slowly, toward one place. The AIMS, Airplane Information Management System. It's not a flashy component. It doesn't control flight surfaces or pressurization, but it sits at the center of everything. It gathers, it routes, it verifies. Every instrument that speaks relies on AIMS to be heard. When it works, it is invisible. But when it falters, even slightly, its effects ripple out across the entire aircraft. In this case, the theory was unsettling, that the AIMS didn't fail outright, but degraded slowly, unevenly, allowing some systems to continue, while allowing others to die without warning. A silent fragmentation of logic. And perhaps most dangerous of all, it didn't announce its failure. It didn't raise alarms. It simply allowed misinformation to spread. The flight crew had unknowingly flown through that ambiguity. Systems that should have protected them had gone silent. Others gave data that might have been wrong, and with each moment, they had been forced to rely not on trust in their instruments, but on trust in themselves. It was a kind of flying that modern aviation rarely calls for anymore. A return to judgment, to manual control, to human resilience in the face of uncertainty. No official cause was released in the months that followed. The airline and the aircraft manufacturer acknowledged an anomaly. Software patches were issued, inspection protocols updated, but there was no headline, no moment of revelation. Just a quiet recognition among those who understood what almost happened, and in that quiet space, the weight of it settled. AI-101 had been one of the safest planes in the sky, piloted by experienced crew, maintained to international standards. Yet all of that had nearly been undone by a fault no one could see. a fault that left them in the air, with no way to know what could be trusted and what could not. It was not a crash, not a tragedy, not the kind of story that ends with sirens and smoke. But for those who understand flight, for those who live within its margins, it was close enough to remember. Time moved differently after they landed. Days passed, maybe a week, before the flight crew returned to the air. Not because they had been grounded or questioned or held responsible, but because something in them needed time to settle, to make peace with the weight of what they had carried across the sky. They didn't speak much about it, at least not outside the circles of those who understood. There are things in aviation, moments lived only in the stillness of a cockpit, that defy easy retelling. Not because they are too dramatic or too complex, but because they are too quiet, too internal. And this was one of them. For Captain Polya, the experience left no scars on the surface. No headlines bore his name. No awards were handed out. But in the silence of that final descent, in the low hum of systems that had failed one after another, he had made a series of decisions few ever have to make. Not heroic, not impulsive, simply necessary. There was no formula for what they had done. No simulator could have trained them for the uncertainty they faced. A partial systems failure is more than a checklist. It is a test of discipline, of restraint, of memory sharpened by fatigue. And through all of it, they held course. What remains now is not drama, or mystery, or fear. What remains is something far more important. Understanding. Understanding that technology, for all its power, is not perfect. That beneath the digital networks and automation, there must still be human hands, capable, calm, and willing to question what no longer makes sense. Understanding that a flight can be safe not because everything went right, but because people responded when things began to go wrong. And, perhaps most of all, understanding that every time an aircraft takes off, it carries more than passengers and fuel. It carries trust in its design, in its maintenance, in the crew inside. And that trust, once shaken, must be earned again, patiently, humbly, and in silence. AI 101 flew again, days later, this time as a repositioning flight empty of passengers returning to Delhi. The systems were inspected, updated, cleared. The fault never repeated. But the story remains. Not for the sensation of what could have happened, but for the simple, unspoken truth of what did. A flight, fragile at its edges, held together not by certainty, but by judgment. Not by technology, but by trust. And somewhere, far above the clouds, the trust still flies, quietly, every day.